This is Nasha Kasha, Ukrainian Almanac, 28 minutes of stories for everyone about Ukrainian life. I'm your reporter, Stefan Andrusiak, and this is episode 255. The worst disaster in the history of nuclear power generation happened 35 years ago this month. Here's the story as it appears in the Britannica Encyclopedia online edition. The Chernobyl power plant was situated at the settlement of Pripyat, 10 miles northwest of the city of Chernobyl and 65 miles north of Kyiv, Ukraine. The station consisted of 4 reactors, each capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electric power. It was April 25, 1986. Technicians at Reactor Unit 4 attempted a poorly designed experiment. Workers shut down the reactor's power regulating system and its emergency safety systems, and they withdrew most of the control rods from its core, while allowing the reactor to continue running at 7% power. These mistakes were compounded by others, and at 1:23 a.m. on April 26th, the chain reaction in the core went out of control. Several explosions triggered a large fireball and blew off the heavy steel and concrete lid of the reactor. This and the ensuing fire in the graphite reactor core released large amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. A partial meltdown of the core also occurred. On April 27th, the 30,000 inhabitants of Pripyat began to be evacuated. A cover-up was attempted, but on April 28th, Swedish monitoring stations reported abnormally high levels of wind-transported radioactivity. The Swedes pressed for an explanation. The Soviet government admitted there had been an accident at Chernobyl. By May 4th, both the heat and the radioactivity leaking from the reactor core were being contained, albeit at great risk to workers. And later in the year, the highly radioactive reactor core was enclosed in a concrete and steel sarcophagus, which was later deemed structurally unsound. Between 50 and 185 million curies of radionuclides, which are radioactive forms of chemical elements, escaped into the atmosphere. This is several times more radioactivity than that created by the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. This radioactivity was spread by the wind over Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Soon it reached as far west as France and Italy. Millions of acres of forest and farmland were contaminated, and although many thousands of people were evacuated, hundreds of thousands more remained in the contaminated areas. In addition, in subsequent years, many livestock were born deformed, and, among humans, several thousand radiation-induced illnesses and cancer deaths were expected in the long term. Ukraine became independent in 1991. Chernobyl Unit 2 was shut down after a fire. Unit 1 remained online until 1996. Chernobyl Unit 3 continued to operate until the year 2000, when the nuclear power station was officially decommissioned. The Edmonton Dnipro Choir, Владико, Неба і Землі, a prayer.
My name is Alexandra Hitchie. I'm the national president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which is the voice of Canada's 1.4 million strong Ukrainian Canadian community. On April 26th, Ukrainians and others around the world will commemorate the 35th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in Ukraine. We are asking all Canadians to pause on this day to remember the thousands of victims of this terrible tragedy. The explosion and meltdown of the nuclear reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near Pripyat, Ukraine, affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And the effects are still being felt today in Ukraine and in Belarus, Ukraine's neighbor, where much of the radioactive fallout landed. The effect and damage of this disaster were made far worse by the Soviet communist regime's obfuscation, lies, and attempts to cover up the scale of the tragedy from the world. I recall how the Ukrainian Canadian community in Canada received daily news and updates with ever-increasing shock and horror as neighboring countries to Ukraine and as far away as Norway and Sweden reported extremely high levels of radiation, and the demand that the Soviets tell the truth resounded around the world. In the week after the explosion, I recall auditing a Soviet history class at the University of Toronto, and as was the custom at U of T in those days, an invitation had been extended to the Soviet embassy to send a representative to deliver a guest lecture. I had attended many of these guest lectures in the past with the purpose of raising human rights abuses in the Soviet Union, but on this day I was armed with the early and horrific news of the nuclear disaster. I was not surprised that on that day the Soviet delegation sent their regrets. They were not prepared to tell the truth about what had happened, but at the same time could not deny the scope and horror of the tragedy. The Chernobyl disaster and the communist authorities' response to it truly exposed the mendacity, cruelty, and callousness and corruption that were the essence of the Soviet system. Estimates of the number of indirect deaths resulting from Chernobyl range from the thousands to the tens of thousands. And Ukraine and Belarus continue to cope with long-term health, environmental, and economic consequences. The Ukrainian people responded with unity and common purpose. In Soviet Ukraine, this disaster served as the catalyst for glasnost and perestroika, which ultimately led to the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. Here in Canada, we organized relief and assistance efforts, which provided aid and comfort to thousands of people who suffered from the effects of Chernobyl. So on this 35th anniversary, we mourn the thousands of victims of the Chernobyl disaster. We pray for the health of those whose lives are still affected. And most of all, this anniversary reminds us of the need for eternal vigilance to ensure the safe use of nuclear power, the importance of democratic oversight and accountability, and the need to protect our environment. May the memory of the victims be eternal. Вічна їм пам'ять.
This is Evan Wish playing his composition, What Will Man's Legacy Be?
My name is Roman Vasychuk. As a Canadian diplomat, I was posted to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, 2 years after the Chernobyl disaster, and then again to Ukraine from 1994 to 1998. During those postings, I never visited the site, but I saw how the public reaction to the disaster undermined trust in the Communist Party, stoked opposition, environmentalism, and forced an opening to the outside world to seek help. I only started going to Chernobyl on my most recent posting. Most tourists now go to the abandoned city of Pripyat. It's a pretty spooky experience. A bit of a sort of Planet of the Apes post-apocalyptic urban landscape. But I mostly visited the plant itself. It's no longer operating, but ironically, it's one of the better maintained Soviet legacy industrial facilities just because so much international attention has been focused on helping Ukraine clean up and deal with the consequences of the disaster. I spent most of my time during visits there with colleagues from Canada as well, on our contribution to helping to secure the so-called sarcophagus, the temporary protective structure put up at great personal risk in the immediate aftermath in 1986 to cover up the reactor core that had melted down. The big project was building a new safe containment structure, and this has turned out to be a great example of international cooperation and cutting-edge engineering and working with Ukrainian expertise. In 2016, I watched about $3 billion worth of international investments slide into place over Reactor 4. Then in 2019, I attended the commissioning of the completed project, which was ready to safely enable the gradual dismantling of the ruins of the reactor. So the big arc over Chernobyl will allow remote-controlled robot arms to pick apart and finally render safe what's left of the reactor core. So actually a big, huge, successful project put together to protect Ukrainians and all of us worldwide from the consequences of the accident. But that success is good news, so you don't hear so much about it.
Roman Vashchuk was Canada's ambassador to Ukraine from 2014 to 2019.
У кожного страждання одна ознака, біда єдиним болем падає у сни. У всіх дітей планети сльоза однаково на світі плачуть всі вони. Кричить тривога, сльозою втрати, стискає горло, наче петля, дитя заплаче, заплаче мати, мати заплаче, заридає
The song Znak Bide, which means sign of trouble, ends with the words, a child cries, a mother cries, and the earth weeps. Lyrics by Mikhailo Tkach, music Alexander Osachi, performed by Lydia Mikhailenko.
Мене звати Ярослав Баран.
Yaroslav Baran is a journalist. He lives in Stebnik, southwest of Lviv. It's 600 kilometers away from Chernobyl.
Що, уже 35? Ну, як то кажуть, звикли. Ми звикли жити з війною, ми звикли жити з Чорнобилем.
Ukrainians adapt to war, adapt to Chernobyl.
Я тоді закінчував якраз лишень перший клас.
I had just finished grade 1 at the time, and I remember vague references to an explosion.
Що щось вибухнуло на рівні чуток, але ніхто нічого конкретно не казав. Пригадую, ми прийшли додому, і батьки нам в цей день заборонили гуляти на вулиці.
Parents forbade us from playing in the street. Rumors had reached even our distant territory, but we had no idea what these concerns for safety were tied to.
Що це? З чим воно пов'язано? Ніхто тоді і гадки не мав.
We had no clue.
Був парад на 1 травня. Нас усіх організовано вивели на цю демонстрацію.
We were led outside and into the May 1st parade.
Почали доходити слухи про те, що сталося в Чорнобилі.
In mid-May, we heard about Chernobyl.
Спочатку Чорнобиль дуже гостро стояв у всіх новинах.
The disaster gained great media traction after the fall of the Soviet Union. It became a wellspring, a negotiating point used by our government as it coaxed donor organizations to cover costs for liquidating the Chernobyl problem.
У нашому ж районі поряд є курортне містечко Трускавець. Щоліта сюди приїжджали і досі приїжджають лікуватися.
Children suffering health after effects of Chernobyl travel to our region for healing and recovery. Two words have entered our local vocabulary like never before.
Онкозахворювання
Cancer
і радіація.
and
На початках
radiation.
точно ніхто не знав, що це. Лише знали, що це щось страшне і небезпечне.
We learned in school that both could be terrible and dangerous.
Довідалися б, що існує такі.
We learned about radiation, knew that there were ways to harness it.
Що є низка хімічних елементів, які здатні продукувати лікувати його. Ну і що в космосі це, в принципі, то і буденна справа. Але щодо онкозахворювань, справді, рік за роком кількість людей хворих на рак ставало щораз більше.
More and more people, decade followed decade.
Через 10, 20, 30 років.
Every year new fundraising efforts pop up.
Оскільки багато благодійних фондів
requesting help fund a cure.
Про допомогу лікування тій чи іншій людині. За тих 35 років
35 years and it seems we haven't learned to protect ourselves from radiation.
Досі люди не навчилися ефективно захищатися від радіації.
I expected that the accident would have sped up the learning.
Що дана аварія таке прискорить процес вивчення цього явища.
Researching the means to curb the problem.
Засобів для захисту.
We're stuck with hypotheses and assumptions.
І, на жаль, досі воно на рівні гіпотез, на рівні припущень. Тому єдине, що побажав усім країнам не допускати до таких аварій.
May countries find a way to jointly prevent such future accidents.
Аби не приховували інформацію.
Share information.
Була б тоді неприхована інформація, можливо б вдалося врятувати набагато більше життів.
Transparency would have saved lives. This is Йордана Дранчук and пісня про Чорнобиль.
Не питай, чому в птаха так дивно підрізані крильця, і чому не летить він в недавно квітучі сади. Там колише матуся колиску, у якої чорні бильця, в ній Чорнобиль залишив свої невиправні сліди. Там колише матуся колиску, у якої чорні бильця, в ній Чорнобиль залишив свої невиправні сліди.
I'm Andriy Samotyuk, and I live in Toronto. I remember the Chernobyl disaster vividly because I was in Edmonton at the time, practicing law with a firm called Biamonte Cairo and Shortreed. And we learned about the catastrophe. And the partners asked me how I felt about it. And I said, well, they just nuked my family. Of course, we didn't know just how extensive the disaster was at that moment. And we didn't learn till later that actually thousands of people had died and, you know, the entire geography had changed in terms of people living in the area and so on. Those were things that would happen later on. But I do remember later traveling to Winnipeg and seeing these big posters of men who had come to the reactor, had gone there to make repairs, to make the site safe for life, for all of us. Later still, I remember traveling to Ukraine with our family, my wife and my son Marko and my daughter. And my son Marko met up with kids from Chernobyl who were vacationing in a camp in the Carpathian Mountains. And we had some time where we spent with these children. They told us stories from their lives. It was very memorable. But Chernobyl was a deciding moment in the life of Ukraine because I think it led to the demise of the Soviet Union. And people just were fed up with the lies related to Chernobyl. So it was a very significant event in that respect.
А у зоні відчуження в хаті бабця в полиняній хустці щовечора молить за спокій на кожній АЕС. Не питай, чому в птаха так дивно підрізані крильця, і чому не летить він в недавно квітучі сади. Там колише матуся колиску, у якої чорні бильця, в ній Чорнобиль залишив свої невиправні сліди. Там колише матуся колиску, у якої чорні бильця, в ній Чорнобиль залишив свої невиправні сліди.
Mario Petrucci is a poet, an ecologist, and a PhD physicist. He lives in England. His book-length poem on Chernobyl called Heavy Water was published by Ethermon Press in 2004. When I reached out to him, he sent me this reading.
Black. In the dark she goes to him for his crusts of hip bone, his weather maps still, wars, medals, a certificate. That first squirt of blood sounds the bedpan as milk sounds the pail. His own mother refuses. At the end of a tube they chart the poppy seed in his lung that splits straight into bloom. He molts, black skin in shawls, spreads dark in the silhouette of Lenin. His livid seed will lodge in the cul-de-sac of a dead village. He will go the way of water, thinks of canal weed entering the slug, knows soon she will feel in his urn for the intimate shells of his death. He leaves her his fat yellow watch, stress germinates it. She wears black and he desires it. Everywhere black rips his bloodlines, bursts from him in fine jets. Those photos down the hall, his own camera crew who come swooping to steer him, to stall his dark. Their booms track a whimper. Where is Papa? Where exactly? There are many rooms. Even the dead fear them.
There was no way they could have known that morning that they awoke upon a fateful day. The killer wind came down without a warning, and no one had the chance to get away.
This is Hans and Dr. Beaker. The song is called Ghost Town.
Уляна Глинчак.
One of the most horrific nuclear disasters on Earth became the single worst horror because Soviets hid it as best they could. May Day parades were encouraged, drawing families into the streets. She was not quite 15 at the time.
Багато людей 1 травня вийшли на демонстрації, вийшли на вулиці, не знаючи, якої шкоди їм може завдати радіація, навіть не знаючи, що такий вибух недалеко від Києва відбувся.
When going to school, we were advised to wear head coverings to prevent hair loss. But it was April. Kids avoided wearing hats and kerchiefs. Instead, we ran to school holding our copybooks over our heads, believing that running would reduce risk.
Нам казали не виходити на вулицю без покриття волосся, тому що волосся буде випадати. Але, звичайно, ми підлітки. Нам не хотілося у квітні ні шапку одягати, ні хустку зав'язувати на голову. То ми бігли до школи, прикриваючи голови портфелями, що, напевно, нічого не давало. І також замість того, щоб просто йти, старалися бігти, щоб зменшити час перебування на вулиці. У школі вчителі видавали нам таблетки йоду.
Once there, teachers distributed iodine tablets.
Від радіації.
We felt safer in Lviv.
Ми жили у Львові з батьками. Я знаю, що ці радіаційні повітряні хмари нас оминули.
But families from Kyiv, which is much closer to Chernobyl,
Багато людей з Києва
would escape to Lviv.
ми приїжджали до Львова.
Today we see the accident zone like some Jurassic Park. Tourists gawking at a lifeless void, where humans were without value, where the Communist Party covered its tracks.
І сьогодні ми бачимо цю Чорнобильську зону, яка тепер виглядає як якийсь Jurassic Park, куди люди тепер їздять як туристи, щоб подивитися, як виглядає місце, де вже ніхто не живе. Чорнобиль назавжди це є символ.
In reality, the USSR was a penitentiary for nations. Humans meant less than emptiness did.
Де комуністична партія прикривала свої сліди будь-якими способами, щоб для світу виглядати успішними, демократичними, передовими. А насправді Радянський Союз – це була тюрма народів, де людина означала менше, ніж порожнє місце. Вічна пам'ять усім загиблим.
May the dead be always remembered. Uliana Hlinchak is a producer for Kontakt Next Gen and a reporter for the program Kontakt. Both can be seen on Omni Television.
Добрий день.
Yuri Munchak remembers it well. Montreal. It was Ukrainian Easter Sunday. At the St. Sophie Ukrainian Orthodox Church,
Я довідався про це.
girls from the Plost Scouting
В
Organization
залі церкви Святої Софії,
were presenting songs and dances we call
які
hayilke.
виводили пластунки. Десь в половині вже дівчата вивели деякі гаюки.
Halfway through the program, a respected community leader broke the Easter joy with news.
І тут раптом пан Паулів, це український діяч з Монтралю, встав і попросив уваги. І так шум трохи притих.
Attendees hushed. He said that a reactor had exploded in Ukraine. A catastrophe was in motion.
Що вибух радіоактивний реактор і що це страшна катастрофа є. І ще тепер пригадую, як в залі така настала тиша. Діти перестали бігати, всі перестали говорити і просто сиділи і старалися зрозуміти, що це за собою потягає. Дійсно, така тиша запанувала. Тривала досить довго, хвилину.
I recall that children stopped playing. Parents tried to assimilate the information, process it. Details of consequences were still to follow, but in Montreal, I understood.
Пригадую, як поволі почали виходити деталі, і як це надзвичайно вдарило українську громаду тут в Монтралі.
Yuri Munchak is assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine at both McGill University and the University of Montreal. He's the scientific director of the Molecular Pathology Center, Jewish General Hospital. Nasha Kasha is also a podcast. There's an easy way to access it. Go to nashakasha.libsyn.com. Nasha Kasha is one word. Libsyn is spelled Libsyn.com. nashakasha.libsyn.com. New Pathway Ukrainian News delivers news and insight every week in English and Ukrainian. Subscribe today at newpathway.ca. Partial funding for Nasha Kasha comes from the Taras Shevchenko Foundation and the Ukrainian Credit Union. I'm your reporter Stefan Andrusyak. Back in a week, God willing. До милої зустрічі за тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.